Hi, welcome back to the second half of Session 8 of History of the CIA in the Third World. And today, of course, we're looking at the Congo. Now, what we did in the first half, of course, is look at the historical crisis, if you will, the history that brought the Congo to the point where the CIA and the U.S. become involved in an intervention. And we saw certain factors that play into the crisis that erupts specifically in 1960. That included the issue of the interaction between Europeans and African elites, stretching all the way back to the Portuguese experience in the Kingdom of the Congo, where local elites were willing to make alliances with Europeans as a way of enhancing their own power, but often leading to the destabilization of their own societies. That could be said of the Mani Congo. It could be said of the tribal leaders who negotiated agreements with King Leopold II of Belgium. We also looked at the Congo itself and its history as reflective in many ways of the major problems in Africa at the time of independence in the years after World War II, namely regionalism, tribalism, and economic underdevelopment. And we saw that the Congo in particular, of the various African colonies and new nations, was particularly afflicted by all three of these problems, and that will become even more evident as we look at events beginning in June of 1960. We also examined the independence movements in Africa in general, using the example of Ghana or the Gold Coast, and how those could be relatively pacific approaches to independence, but at times violence also became a critical factor. Places like Kenya, and as we will see, of course, the Congo itself. And we finally examined the United States and the Soviet Union, their policies towards the Third World, and specifically African independence, and saw that the Americans were willing to talk about self-determination, but not willing to do much for fear of sacrificing the interests of the European allies. The Soviets paid little attention until the middle of the 1950s, but then under Khrushchev, were showing an interest in Third World independence and hoping to create allies among the independence leaders, and the Congo would become a prime example. Those forces between the after effects of colonialism, and particularly in the Congo, its lack of preparedness for independence, as well as the mounting challenge that the United States perceived from the Soviet Union and the Third World, and its concern with the economic resources and strategic location of the Congo, all of these factors will come into play and further destabilize the situation in the Congo, beginning with independence in June 30th, 1960. If we go back to that slide that we ended last time with, again, we ended with Independence Day and Lumumba's speech, which was critical of the Belgians, but seen in historical context seems a fairly accurate retelling of the events that had led to independence, and particularly the sacrifices of the Congolese to achieve independence. Nevertheless, it is perceived by the Belgians, and particularly by Clark Timberlake, the U.S. ambassador to the Congo, as indications that indeed Lumumba is a communist, a fellow traveler, whatever, that he plans to deliver the Congo into the hands of the Soviets by one means or another. Now, the immediate problem for Lumumba would not be Ambassador Timberlake or Lawrence Devlin, the CIA station chief in Leopoldville, but his own military. As I mentioned in the first half, the Congolese National Army, as constituted in June of 1960, largely consisted of Congolese enlisted men and NCOs ruled over by a group of white officers. This was a source of deepening discontent, and a few days after independence, mutinies occurred within the military as the black NCOs rebelled against commands from their white officer class. Immediately, Lumumba and Kasavubu tried to get the situation under control. In fact, the two of them, the prime minister and his president, begin flying to different military sites around the new country, trying to negotiate a solution to the mutinies. And they promised two things. One is pay raises for the military, and secondly, that the white officers will be removed and that the Congolese NCOs will be promoted into those commissioned officer slots. They need, of course, to win the support of this new military and have it consolidate behind the national government, something that's certainly not happening in early July of 1960 as these mutinies occur. From the Belgian government's perspective, this set of mutinies, in which some violence did occur, but in which no Europeans were injured, was a clear sign that this new government was beginning to disintegrate. And immediately, the Belgians began to send in additional troops on top of the 4,000 that were already there, split between Leopoldville and Elizabethville. They are now sending an additional 6,000 troops, according to them, to protect Belgians and other Europeans who are in the Congo at this time. And there, of course, is all kinds of stories regarding a race war possibly erupting in the Congo, stories being transmitted by media in both Europe and the United States. In fact, again, no Europeans were killed. There was some violence in the streets in Leopoldville and elsewhere, but no Europeans were killed. This was strictly a Congolese matter of a mutiny by the military and their opposition to the existing conditions. Given the instability that occurred, and Lumumba's very real concern that the real purpose of the increased Belgian military contingent was to reimpose Belgian control over the Congo, Lumumba is going to appeal to the United Nations for assistance, essentially for a peacekeeping force to help ensure stability and as a way of ridding himself of the Belgian military, because of course the last thing he wanted was thousands of Belgian troops occupying his country. And in fact, the Belgian troops had left their barracks in Leopoldville and were now patrolling the streets of the capital. And as far as Lumumba was concerned, this was a clear step by the Belgians to reassert their control over their former colony. So he appeals to the United Nations for assistance. At the United Nations, the debate over providing assistance to the new nation of the Congo immediately breaks down into a Cold War debate, as things often did in the UN at this time. We're talking about 1960, the Cold War is still at a fever pitch, if you will. The Americans and the Soviets each suspecting the other of all kinds of nefarious activities around the globe. And the real fight is who's going to control the UN peacekeeping force? Is it going to be essentially an American-dominated force, not necessarily in the troops that are sent, but who's going to decide who goes? Or is it going to be a situation where the Soviets have significant influence? Eventually, an agreement is reached to send a UN peacekeeping force, which will consist primarily of Western European troops and troops from a couple of African nations that are pro-Western. The Soviet Union and Eastern Europe are largely left out of the peacekeeping force itself. They will not be contributing significant numbers of troops to the peacekeeping force. So this is clearly a victory for the Americans. This is a UN force that largely reflects their political interests, not those of the Soviet Union. But as these events are unfolding in New York at the UN headquarters, more trouble is breaking out in the Congo, because on July 11th, Moise Tshombe, if you remember, Tshombe was the third candidate for the prime ministership. He is now the president of the province of Katanga. Moise Tshombe has taken his province of Katanga and seceded from the Congo. He's breaking away from the new country, which is now less than 2 weeks old. This, of course, would be a devastating blow to the new nation, because Katanga province is the main source of the Congo's wealth. It produces most of the copper, cobalt, and other minerals that are the principal exports of the Congo at this time. So this threatens to destroy the Congo before it even has a chance to truly become a fully independent nation. Lumumba, not surprisingly, is extremely suspicious of what's going on because Tshombe is able to do this because he has more than 2,000 Belgian troops in Katanga province who are well armed and prepared to protect him and his secessionist province. And why would they do that? Well, they would do that because, of course, Tshombe is closely tied to Union Minière, the Belgian mining company that monopolizes the mining industry in Katanga province. So as far as Lumumba is concerned, this is just another way for the Belgians to seize control of the most important parts of the Congo. They have troops patrolling the streets of Leopoldville, and now they're going to be the dominant military force in a newly independent Katanga, which will take away the heart of the Congo's new national economy. So, not surprisingly, Lumumba pretty well figures this is another gambit by the Belgians to either simply destroy the Congo, or if that doesn't work, to leave it stripped of any important economic resources and leave themselves in control of the most important economic resources in Central Africa, namely the mines in Katanga province. So Lumumba is not too happy with the Western powers in general at this point. However, he does get reassurances from Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier. Khrushchev promises in a non-specific way that he will support the new national government of the Congo and Patrice Lumumba, its prime minister. Now, what does that amount to? Does that mean economic assistance, military aid? Well, it's not clear. It's a very flowery speech full of commitment to third world independence and denouncing European and Western imperialism and promising comradeship with Patrice Lumumba. But what does that mean? Well, it's not clear. But at least it's something that Lumumba sees as a lever that he can use in dealing with the West. Now, that I do have some friends out here. It isn't England and Belgium and the United States and all you people, ganging up on me through the UN. I've got some allies out there. Now, with events having taken this set of turns, the U.S. attitude towards Lumumba has steadily deteriorated as we go through July. They, of course, reacted negatively to the independence speech on June 30th. Then there was the issue of the mutinies and Lumumba's clear denunciation of the Belgians, who he believed were using this as a pretext to seize control. And now there is his denunciation of Katangan independence, and again tying that to a Belgian plot. And on top of that comes this promise of assistance from the Soviet Union. Everything would seem to be pointing in the direction that Lumumba is somehow tied to the Soviets and that he is anti-American in every sense. However, Christian Herter, who was the Secretary of State at this time, he was Secretary of State because John Foster Dulles had died. So they obviously needed a replacement. Christian Herter, who was the Secretary of State, agrees to meet with Lumumba, who is coming to the United States primarily to personally address the United Nations and talk about the problems of his new country and to ask for additional assistance. So Herter and Lumumba will meet in Washington. They have a meeting at the State Department, a fairly lengthy discussion between the two of them. And that evening, Herter goes home and writes in his memoirs that he thinks Lumumba is a psychotic. So obviously the meeting didn't go all that well. This is the product of several factors. First, Christian Herter was what we call a Boston Brahmin. He was from the old elite in Massachusetts. He had grown up, with all the people that and gone to Ivy League institutions. He was from one of the old families of New England. So he was a highly educated elite member. And he had spent some time in international diplomacy for the United States. And he was used to the way that older white gentlemen in Europe and the United States dealt with each other. In other words, diplomats. They never yelled at each other, and they never said bad words to each other. They always spoke in sort of indirect terms. And here he was with this young Congolese man who's in his early 30s, who's just become the prime minister of a new nation, who has a high school education, who is used to speaking very directly about the problems of his country and about how he feels about things. He's not one to engage in diplomatic niceties. And here he is being very direct with Herder and very critical of what he feels has been a failure on the part of the United States and other Western powers to rein in the Belgians and to provide him with the kind of assistance that he needs. So, not surprisingly, they didn't get along. And that was probably the last opportunity for any kind of reconciliation between the U.S. government, the Eisenhower administration, and Patrice Lumumba. Once Herder decided that Lumumba was no good, that was it. I mean, things were already on a sharp downward course, as we will see, and as we have seen. But once this interview occurred and didn't go well, that was it. There was no pulling back. The United States would not make any further effort to reconcile in any way with Patrice Lumumba. Meanwhile, Lumumba is having his own problems, not only with Herder, but with the United Nations Secretary General, the man who essentially runs the United Nations, like Kofi Annan today, a Swede named Dag Hammarskjöld. I'm sure you'll all spell it correctly on the final exam. Just pronounce it like it looks, Hammarskjöld. You'll be able to spell it correctly. Anyways, Dag Hammarskjöld was the UN Secretary General. He was relatively pro-Western, although technically neutral in his position. Lumumba had turned to Hammarskjöld and asked for assistance in bringing Katanga province back into his nation, suppressing the secessionist movement under Tshombe. And of course, there were UN troops by now in the Congo who could have done this. But Hammarskjöld says, well, look, we're not there to deal with internal political issues. So we're not going to take any part of that. That is, from our perspective, an internal political issue, and we are not there to deal with that kind of problem. And immediately, from Lumumba's perspective, this is an indication that, well, you know, Hammarskjöld's in cahoots with the Belgians. You know, he wants to allow this secession to occur and give the Belgians their control over the mining industry that they wanted to retain all along. However, while Hammarskjöld is saying no, the Soviets are willing to say yes. And they are willing to provide assistance to Lumumba to retake Katanga province. They're going to provide transportation, in other words, trucks, communications equipment, and military advisors, so that Lumumba can use the Congolese National Army to suppress the secessionist movement in Katanga province. Now, Clark Timberlake sees the Soviet commitment, and he argues that what we are witnessing in the Congo, and this is according to him, I'm paraphrasing what he said in a cable, what we are witnessing in the Congo is tantamount to what we witnessed in China, meaning the Chinese Communist Revolution, which had come to power in 1950. Only in this case, it's a takeover through advisors instead of through bayonets. In other words, these Soviet advisors, what it really amounts to is a Soviet takeover of the Congo. That's what's happening here. You know, it's not an all-out armed communist revolution like we saw in China, but it's going to accomplish the same purpose. the Congo will wind up in communist hands thanks to these Soviet advisors that Lumumba has brought in. And this, of course, further cements his belief and the belief of policymakers in Washington that indeed Lumumba is closely tied to the Soviet Union. He's certainly making ties to the Soviet Union, but that's because he feels like the West is supporting the Belgians and their attempts to either undermine his country and its independence, or at the very least to break off Katanga province and retain control of its wealth. Back in Washington, meanwhile, President Eisenhower tells his National Security Council that above all else, the United States must not allow UN forces to be pushed out of the Congo. And he fears that that's exactly what Lumumba is going to do. In fact, Lumumba has talked about the fact that he wants all of the white troops, the non-African troops, or well, I shouldn't say non-African, but all the white troops, in other words, the European troops, out of the Congo. You know, there are others, there are African troops, there are troops from India, that's fine, but he doesn't want these white Europeans there. And Eisenhower believes that that's just a prelude to demanding the complete evacuation of UN forces, and that the Soviets will be left there with these advisors and the ones who have the upper hand in the Congo. By now, and we're still in the month of July, by the way. By now, the National Security Council has met several times to discuss events in the Congo. And one of the strategies that they have initiated through the CIA is to promote enemies of Lumumba. In other words, to try to undermine him by providing support to political opponents in the Congo. One of the logical ones, by the way, would be Kasavubu. They were political competitors, even though he's technically the president of the new government. So people like Kasavubu, but also provincial leaders, are to be supported and promoted in the hopes that they will do something about Lumumba, that they will strike out and get rid of him, they will undermine his authority. The principal focus of these efforts is, in fact, Kasavubu, the president, the reluctant president, as I say here. And I say that because Kasavubu was being urged by the Americans and offered all kinds of assistance, etc., if he would act against Lumumba and oust him from power. But Kasavubu was reluctant to do that. He was unwilling to take any forceful action against Lumumba, largely out of timidity. He figured, well, what if this doesn't work? You know, you guys pack up and go home to Washington in Langley, Virginia. I may go to the firing squad. So he is unwilling to do that, despite constant prodding from the U.S. ambassador and from the CIA itself, in the person of Laurent Devlin. In another National Security Council meeting, Allen Dulles makes it clear that in terms of the president's policy, Lumumba's removal must be an urgent and prime objective. And these words are a quote from a National Security Council meeting. Okay, and when he says his, he means Lumumba's removal. And when he says removal, the people in the National Security Council meeting understood dead. Okay, not removal like we'll put him someplace else besides Leopoldville. They assumed it meant dead. Okay, these are the terms under which these things are discussed. When this kind of decision is made in a formal meeting and notes are being taken, nobody says, okay, let's whack that guy. They say things like, you know, he has to be removed, okay? He has to be eliminated. And, well, there are various ways you can determine, interpret, eliminate. These people know. I mean, the general consensus in the room was meaning we're going to kill him. Now, of course, if this series of decisions and actions had been exposed at the time, and anyone had said, well, look at right here, it says his removal must be an urgent and prime objective, they'd say, well, yeah, but nobody said kill him, right? So if somehow we got whacked, it's not our fault. You know, we just wanted to get him out of the way, you know, like hold a new election, you know, or something, or send him into exile. Nobody said kill him. And that's true. You know, those words are not used. But everyone understood, as you will see, they knew what this meant, because the CIA was going to act on precisely this statement, and they weren't talking about sending Lumumba into exile. In August, and again, we're still in 1960, Lumumba now has the wherewithal, at least sufficient wherewithal, with some Soviet advisors and trucks, etc., to invade Katanga province, to take the national army and send it, well, he goes with it, southeast into Katanga province to try and get rid of Shombe and end the secession of that mineral-rich province. The effort fails. The fact is there are thousands of well-armed, well-trained Belgian troops in Katanga province. There are a couple of thousand poorly trained Congolese troops that are not well-armed. You know, the Soviets were not supplying that much. They were supplying transportation equipment, walkie-talkies. They had some military advisors. But these people are not heavily armed, not nearly as well-armed as the Belgians are, and they get driven back. As Lumumba heads back to Leopoldville, the capital, having been defeated in his effort to oust Shombe, it's now that Kasavubu feels that he can get rid of Lumumba. Kasavubu announces that he's removing the prime minister. Now, actually, there's nothing in the Congolese constitution that said he could do that. You know, the way you remove a prime minister is that a majority of the National Assembly, which is really a parliament, a majority of that assembly would vote yes on a vote of no confidence. That's how you get rid of a prime minister. Yeah, we have an election every 4 years. In a parliamentary system, you have to have an election usually like every 6 years, but in the meantime, you can get rid of the prime minister because the majority of the National Assembly or parliament votes against him or her. That hadn't happened. But Kasavubu claims that he has the right to do this, that Lumumba has violated the national interests of his nation, and so he's removing him. Is that legal? Well, nothing in the Constitution says it is, but of course, for the Americans, that was more than enough because they felt they now had a legal justification, just as with Mossadegh in Iran, when they said, well, once the Shah issues that firman removing Mossadegh, you know, that gives us a legal premise for acting against him. So to hear their argument would be, well, he's no longer legally the prime minister of the Congo because the president has removed him. Now, Lumumba immediately heads to the capital to fight back. He knows he's still got a majority of the National Assembly on his side. Now, Kasavubu has ordered it closed, but Lumumba figures he can rally those representatives, get them to a meeting, and they'll vote against what Kasavubu has done, and he will be recognized as the ruling prime minister of the Congo. When he gets to the capital, one of the first things he wants to do to rally his supporters is to get on the national radio station and broadcast the news that he's back in the capital, that he rejects Kasavubu's action, and that he's calling for the National Assembly to meet and reject that action as well. But when he gets to the national radio station in the capital, it's surrounded by UN troops, and they won't let him in. So, you know, Lumumba says, well, you know, wait a minute, I thought you guys didn't get involved in internal political struggles, right? What could be more internal than the fact that this is the national radio station? I've been thrown out by the president, and I insist that I have a right to be the prime minister. But the UN forces ignored him, and there was not much Lumumba could do, so he cannot gain access to the national radio network in order to try to rally his supporters. But of course, that's not going to stop him from continuing to try to do that anyways. So events by the end of August have taken, to say the least, an ugly turn. The effort to suppress The secessionist province has failed. Kasavubu, the president, has claimed that he has ousted the prime minister. The prime minister has come back to the capital, is trying to rally his supporters. Things are confused, to say the least. Now another figure will enter the fray. He is one of the new Congolese officers in the Congolese army, and his name is Joseph Mobutu. He has a Christian first name because he was educated at a Christian school under the Belgians. He has been involved on the side of Congolese independence, the same kind of movement, or the same movement that Kasavubu was involved with, for some years, because he is himself a Congolese. In that capacity, as a promoter of independence in the 1950s, he came to the attention of the Central Intelligence Agency. And at some point, we don't know exactly when, he went on their payroll as an informer to provide them with information on what was going on, because the CIA wants to be kept informed of the independence movement in the various independence movement, not just in the Congo, but throughout Africa. So where they could, they identified people who would take money from them and provide them with insider information on what was going on. Now, just because the United States isn't willing to back the independence movement doesn't mean they don't want to know what's going on. Just as you can be sure today that in the labyrinth of Iraqi politics, the CIA has all kinds of people on its payroll telling them they think the truth about what's going on. Mobutu was that kind of individual operating for the CIA sometime by the late 1950s. Furthermore, after independence, after June 30th, there had been a plot within the Congolese military to assassinate Mobutu. The exact reasons had to do with political struggles between the Congolese and other ethnic groups, but there was a plot to assassinate Mobutu. Laurent Devlin learned of the plot through another informer and warned Mobutu. So Mobutu avoided being assassinated thanks to the CIA. So he owed them a certain debt of gratitude. At this point, and we've now reached early September of 1960, Mobutu acts and announces that he is taking control of the government. So Kasavubu can go home. Lumumba is going to be dealt with. And, of course, the National Assembly is not going to be called back in. Mobutu, at least for the immediate future, is going to rule. His argument is, look, we've had all this instability, the mutiny, the secession of Katanga province, the attempt to recapture it. There's been all this instability in the country. We need stability to move forward with the independence process, so I'm taking charge. Now, did he do it entirely on his own with some urging from the CIA? Certainly a combination. He's definitely an ambitious man. It wasn't as if the CIA sat down and said, well, Joe, you got to go seize the government. I'm sure it was largely his idea, but of course, the CIA would be more than happy to say, this would be a very good idea, and if you were to do this, you'd certainly have our full-fledged support. So it's a combination of both personal ambition, but also assurances from the CIA that he would get U.S. backing for his actions. Now, as far as Lumumba goes, Lumumba is put under house arrest by the UN. And their argument, and it was not an unreasonable argument, was that they were doing this to protect him, because it was pretty clear to most people that Mobutu was not going to handle Lumumba gently. He suspected Lumumba or elements of Lumumba's movement were involved in the assassination attempt. They were not exactly friends, and it was pretty clear that Mobutu probably wouldn't stop at most anything to get rid of Lumumba. So the United Nations was going to protect him by putting him under house arrest. Now, as we continue through September and into October, in September, we're in a situation where Lumumba has been removed by Kasavubu, but then Mobutu has intervened, and he's now taken power. But Mobutu's still alive. I mean, Lumumba's still alive, and he's under UN protection. Furthermore, supporters of Lumumba from his home province, which is, again, Oriental province, the northeastern part of the Congo, they are organizing an armed force and are planning on marching on the capital, which is a long way away, but they're arming themselves and preparing to march on the capital to free Lumumba and put him back in power. So this is not a very stable situation. And the Katanga province, of course, is still in secession. So what might happen out of all of this is still very unclear. And from the United States perspective, the biggest danger is still Lumumba. You know, he's the one that they see as this, you know, communist lackey who's been friendly with Khrushchev, and they feel something has to be done about him. And they are in the process of carrying out that dictate that his removal has to be a primary objective. There are plans underway to physically eliminate Lumumba by the CIA. Richard Bissell, if you remember, Bissell, of course, was one of the architects of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which, of course, he's in the process of planning at the same time that he's doing this stuff. He is Alan Dulles' right-hand man in the CIA. Richard Bissell wires Laurent Devlin and authorizes the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. He will authorize specifically the expenditure of $100,000 to get it done. Now, to achieve this goal, the CIA is willing to offer its technical assistance. Specifically, Bissell wires Devlin and tells him to expect Joe from Paris to arrive in Leopoldville at the end of September. And he's to meet with him regarding Patrice Lumumba. Joe from Paris, who Devlin does meet in Leopoldville at the end of the month, turns out to be Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who's the head of the CIA's Science and Technology Division. Sidney, if you remember, he was involved in the LSD experiments that led to the death of the Army civilian employee, etc. Sidney Gottlieb has brought with him a toxin and syringes and needles, just to be complete, which is to be used in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Now, we don't know exactly what this toxin was. What we do know is that they tried to find something that was indigenous to Central Africa, so it would look natural. They didn't want to pick something like Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Probably wouldn't be considered a natural occurrence in Central Africa. Now, as to the specifics, they had also worked that out as to a method of delivery. What was to be done is that they were to find someone, Devlin and the CIA officers in Leopoldville, were to find someone who is at least known to Lumumba, who would be able to get into his house and meet with him, for whatever reason, social occasion, whatever. While there, this individual would go to the bathroom and take Lumumba's toothpaste tube and inject it with the toxin, so that the next time Patrice went to brush his teeth, the toxin would penetrate his blood system through his gums, and you know, you've got lots of blood vessels there, and be killed by it. After that, who could tell where it came from? I mean, even if they found it in the tube of toothpaste, which would seem highly unlikely, and they weren't going to be that technical, but even if they did, who could prove who put it in there? You know, it could have been anybody, anytime, who knows? So this seemed like a very safe way of doing it. Now the issue in October is to find the assassin who will do this. And this proves to be a very difficult process. Needless to say, the CIA doesn't know a lot of friends of Patrice Lumumba. Haven't been very friendly towards him since the beginning. And they are unable to find anyone who is close enough to have a reason to go meet with Lumumba and yet is willing to take money to kill him. So they are caught in this dilemma. They're constantly watching Lumumba's residence, and they continue to search for a possible assassin, but are unable to find one. And as they fail to do that, the weeks are passing, and this force is being put together in Oriental Province that threatens to attack the capital and oust Mobutu and reinstall Lumumba as prime minister. So they are becoming increasingly desperate as to what to do to deal with Lumumba and try to eliminate him and try to eliminate what they see as the threat to Mobutu's regime. Lumumba, in his own way, will help provide a solution near the end of November. He decides that he's going to escape from his own house and head to Oriental Province, where he can further assist in rallying his supporters. Before he leaves, he writes a letter to his wife and says that one thing that his country needs is martyrs, and he does not mind being a martyr for his new nation. He was telling her in his own way that he was going to take this gamble and try to escape from the capital and lead the rebellion. He does escape from the house, but on December 1st, Mobutu's forces find him as he's making his way out of Leopoldville province, and they take him back to the capital. Needless to say, his welcome from Mobutu is not a gracious one. He's beaten up on several occasions while he's being held in a prison there. However, even with Mobutu back, or I should say Lumumba back, and now held directly by Mobutu, the problem is, what are we going to do? Mobutu doesn't dare kill Lumumba in Leopoldville. The United Nations is there. Everyone will know that he did it. And it could well alienate world opinion sufficiently that the United Nations would pull out and leave him to his own ends. So that would be a real danger, that it would destabilize Mobutu's very recent regime. So they have to find some way to get rid of Lumumba and the threat that he represents as a living symbol of resistance, but they have to do it without directly implicating Mobutu and his new government. The answer comes in mid-January, when they decide to take Lumumba and fly him to Stanleyville. Stanleyville, of course, is the capital of Katanga province. It is ruled by Mwishambe, another archenemy of Lumumba. And of course, in Stanleyville, the United Nations is not there. The world press doesn't have a lot of access there. So whatever happens there is not going to be closely reported. So essentially, Lumumba is delivered into the hands of his enemies by Mobutu and by the CIA. And if you ask, well, what the CIA really involved? Oh yeah, we have cables that went between the CIA station in Leopoldville and the station in Stanleyville in Katanga province. The CIA was fully aware and fully supportive of what was being done. And there, in Stanleyville, on January 19th, 1961, Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. Now, the question was, and for many years, for decades, who pulled the trigger? Did the CIA carry out the assassination directly? How were they involved? And if they didn't do it, who did kill Lumumba? We now know the answer to that question. Operating in Katanga province were officers of the Belgian intelligence service, with, of course, close ties to the CIA. It was an officer from the Belgian intelligence service who took a group of Katangese troops, in other words, troops, the local provincial troops, and took Lumumba out of his prison cell, out into the countryside, tied him to a tree, and shot him. They then hastily buried him at the site where he was assassinated. But then concerns immediately arose that this was too sloppy a job. You know, maybe they'll find the body. Maybe they'll be able to figure out what happened here. That this, because the official story is he was shot while trying to escape. Huh? But that was the official story. Well, if his body shows up buried in the woods somewhere, they're going to know that that's not the case. So we have to do something. The local Belgian police commissioner, Gerard Sote, was assigned the job of cleaning up the mess. And he went out with several assistants, dug up Lumumba's body, and burned it, broke up the bone fragments, and scattered them so there would be no trace of Lumumba's body, and therefore no physical evidence to refute the official story that he was shot while trying to escape. End of story. Shortly before he was killed, Lumumba had written to a friend about his situation. And this is a quote from his letter, where he wrote, "I prefer to die with my head unbowed, my faith unshakable, and with a profound trust in the destiny of my country." He pretty well knew that his days were numbered. Unfortunately, his hope for the future of his country would not be fulfilled. The CIA's role in all of this, facilitators. They had tried to kill Lumumba themselves, but had failed. Then, when he was in the direct grasp of their own informant, Mobutu, they feared killing him because of the presence of the UN and the international press and the repercussions that might have in terms of a continuing UN presence in the Congo itself. So instead, arrangements were made to ship Lumumba out of Leopoldville to Stanleyville to deliver him to Moise Tshombe, something that the CIA was fully aware of and helped facilitate. And of course, while they might not have pulled the trigger, they certainly knew exactly what was going to happen to Lumumba soon after he was moved to Katanga province. Now, as I said, Lumumba's hopes for his country were not going to be fulfilled. In fact, what happened after his death in early 1961 was an ongoing civil war within the Congo, pitting Lumumba's supporters against Mobutu, and then involving a complex array of factions. All of the problems of tribal, ethnic differences, regional conflicts erupted to the surface in the aftermath of his death and created a multi-sided civil war. It takes more than 5 years to bring that civil war to an end. And ultimately, Joseph Mobutu emerges as the ruler of the Congo, thanks in no small measure to substantial support from the U.S. To help him in winning this civil war. Now, Mobutu's reputation suffered severely in Africa because most people knew in one way or another, whatever the specifics were, and nobody knew the specifics at the time, but they knew one way or another Mobutu was responsible for Lumumba's assassination. And Lumumba, dead, had emerged as a martyr to the cause of not only Congolese independence, but national independence in general in Africa. And so Mobutu was seen as obviously a key player in Lumumba's demise. Furthermore, he was roundly denounced in other African countries as a lackey of the CIA, because most people knew to one degree or another, that he had ties to the Central Intelligence Agency. In the years after the suppression of the Civil War, he goes to great lengths to try to establish himself as an authentic national African leader. One of the things he does is he gives up his Christian name, the first name Joseph, and takes up the name Mobutu Sese Seko to show that he in fact identifies with his African roots. He also changes the name of the Congo to Zaire, again to show that, that the Congo is a Western name, this is an African name. He runs certainly one of the most corrupt, maybe not one of the most brutal, but probably one of the most brutal, but definitely one of the most corrupt regimes in all of Africa. Bribes become essentially the norm. He compiles a fortune that was estimated even in the late 1970s at over $1 billion, a personal fortune of his own, and largely dissipates the resources of his country, which by now include, once again, the mineral riches of Katanga province, which was brought back into the fold during the course of the Civil War. And yet most of these resources are largely wasted. And he does little to resolve the regional and ethnic conflicts that had long troubled Congolese society. It's only in 1997, when he is facing a series of rebellions in his country and suffering from terminal prostate cancer, that he finally agrees to abandon Zaire, or the Congo, and go into exile, where he will die a few months after he leaves the Congo. The Congo continues to disintegrate, however, after his departure. This man, listed on the slide here, Laurent Kabila, had long been an opponent of Mobutu Sese Seko, dating all the way back to the 1960s. And it was his struggle against Mobutu Sese Seko, or Joseph Mobutu, which finally drove Mobutu out of power in 1997. And Laurent Kabila then becomes the ruler of Zaire, which he renames the Democratic Republic of the Congo. However, shortly after he takes power, Laurent Kabila is assassinated. What has happened in the intervening years, and we're talking, of course, now more than half a decade, is that the Congo disintegrated once again into civil war. But a civil war which included an innumerable array of factions, reflecting again the deep ethnic and regional divisions within the Congo itself. And increasingly, as that struggle dragged on, neighboring countries, including Angola and others, involved themselves by supporting various factions. There has been speculation in recent years that the Congo will not survive as a single independent nation, that ultimately it'll wind up being fragmented. There have been fears that its neighbors would carve it up, or simply that the country would dissolve into a series of distinct political entities representing various regional and tribal factions. Whether that will happen or not is unclear. What is clear is that the Congo's economy has completely collapsed. The railway system has collapsed. The mining industry, which was the source of its wealth, has largely disintegrated, partly because of warfare, partly because of the scourge of AIDS, which destroyed much of the skilled labor force in Katanga province, and of course from total mismanagement down through the years. So the national economy, the national transportation system have collapsed. A larger part of the Congo's national wealth every year is smuggled than is exported legally from the country. So it is a sad commentary on this country that had such enormous potential, that was believed would be, back in the late 1950s, the leader of Central Africa and maybe all of Sub-Saharan Africa, that it has now a country that is on the verge of disintegration, whose national economy has collapsed, and whose people have suffered endless years of violence and conflict among competing factions. So a far cry from what Lumumba had once hoped. With all of this in mind, the question is, how did this come about? Why did it come about? And what are the central factors involved in the outcome? We're dealing with a case here that is distinct. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, one of the things that's distinct about the Congo is that time compression, that we're dealing with a period from June 30th, 1960, effectively January 19th, 1961, 6 months approximately. That has some effect on tactics. We see that the CIA does make an attempt to rally individual political leaders in the Congo against Lumumba, such as Kasavubu. But really the main strategy has to do with assassination. That's pretty well decided early on, and that's the course that they will continue on until they succeed one way or another in accomplishing it. That also affects our assessment of the factors that impact outcomes, that we're dealing with a short time frame. And there is a particularly distinctive factor here that we're going to talk about. First of all, as far as, if we just take political participation. Political participation was high in the Congo. I mean, after all, a series of independence movements had emerged in the late 1950s, successfully pressured the Belgians for independence. There had been national elections. So we can certainly argue that participation was at a high level. And that would be a factor, of course, that would weigh against the success of a CIA intervention. Now, the higher the level of participation, the more complicated the situation is. It's not just a matter of controlling a few individuals or a capital city if you have high levels of political participation. Now, we look at political support. Certainly, on the one hand, Lumumba enjoyed a majority coalition in the new National Assembly. His party, the MNC, which had elected representatives from 5 of the 6 provinces, had 37 members of the National Assembly and had pulled together other political parties to give them a majority. So in that sense, he had majority support. On the other hand, the fact is that his movement represented a minority within the national electorate because no party was able to secure a majority, and its technical political majority in the National Assembly tended to obscure the fact that the Congo was deeply divided over regional and ethnic issues. I mean, Kasavubu is really not a national candidate. He's running on behalf of the Congolese people. Shombe isn't really a national candidate. He's running on behalf of the Katangese people. And of course, Katanga province will secede within 2 weeks after independence. So political support, technically yes, the government has a majority. In reality, on the ground, there are deep and often violent divisions within the political process. But in this case, the most important factor that has widespread influence is coherence of the state. It's the most important factor because it's a non-factor. There is no coherence of the state because there's not really a state. This is a country that emerged as an independent nation on June 30th. Within 2 months' time, the CIA is plotting to assassinate its leader. The most important province economically is Sese. This is a country who, when these things are happening, has a military that's really 2 months old. It has a National Assembly, which is 2 months old. It has a national bureaucracy, which is 2 months old. As Americans are learning, once again, in recent events, you can't create a nation state like that. It takes years to put together the institutions, the working understandings that make a coherent state, that make a functioning state. Fine, you can write a constitution. You can write lots of constitutions. Lots of people have. But that doesn't give you a functioning, coherent state, an experienced bureaucracy. People who know the rules of the game. People whose commitment is to an abstraction called the nation state. If you take and contrast the United States for a moment, or you could use dozens of examples, but it's the obvious one. If someone assassinates the President of the United States, as has happened 4 times in the history of our country, the country goes on functioning. The state goes on functioning. And the most recent assassination of John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s, for all the national trauma, the fact is the state went on functioning. The military was there, on alert. The police were out in the streets, okay, doing their job as they normally would. The Social Security Administration was still cutting checks and didn't stop cutting checks for people. The political parties went on functioning. Everything went on functioning because you have a thoroughly bureaucratized set of institutions. In other words, people know the rules. They work for the state. They don't work for an individual, they work for the state. You may kill the individual, you may disrupt the process, but you're not going to undermine the basic factors of the state. You have a state system, you have a bureaucracy, you have long-functioning political parties that know the rules of the game. None of those things existed in the Congo. They couldn't. Even if the Congo had been relatively well prepared, and we know they weren't, even if it had been well prepared in terms of the total number of educated people, people with experience in the bureaucracy, they would have had a matter of days to put together a functioning state. So the problem with this factor and why it's so important is because the state really hadn't come into existence yet. It couldn't come into existence in a matter of weeks. So everything was up for grabs. And this is why, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but why the tactic of assassination works here. And we won't really see it as a tactic anywhere else. An assassination will occur in Vietnam, but it's not really a tactic, a planned tactic of the CIA. It can work here because you're dealing with a set of forces that are largely focused on individuals, like Lumumba, like Shombe, Kasavubu, Mobutu. You can influence the outcome of events by eliminating one of them, particularly Lumumba, who is the head of state and heads this fairly large political movement. But even it is relatively new. If you can eliminate that one individual, you can change things because you don't have the established bureaucracies in the state and the political parties that will carry on. And this was the fundamental weakness that really opened up a door of opportunity for the CIA and why the CIA would so quickly come to focus on assassination as the answer. Because here, it may well work. Assassinated another political leader somewhere else where institutions, even you took Guatemala, if you assassinated Arbenz, no, that wasn't necessarily going to change things. You had a set of institutions, political institutions. You couldn't be sure what would happen. Here, you can be fairly certain you can put a major blow in against Lumumba's movement if you eliminate him, because so much depends on individual personalities at a time when a state system has not yet emerged. Now, to look at the other factors as we normally do. Economic conditions are largely irrelevant. Things weren't going well, obviously, if your most important province economically is seceded. But given the very short time frame, it would be hard to make any assessment of economic impact, because even if things are going badly economically, they're only going badly for a few months. So it's not going to have that much effect on who people support or what they do. As far as openness, it would be hard to be getting any more open than the Congo was. I mean, the Belgians are able to send in 6,000 more troops. They have to call upon the UN to bring them in. They got Sidney Gottlieb flying right into the capital to meet with, Laurent Devlin to talk about the assassination of the prime minister of this country. That's pretty open. We have wires being sent. They weren't even fully encoded, talking about this stuff between Leopoldville and Stanleyville, the CIA stations. So things are wide open. CIA can operate with relative impunity because, again, one of the things about this, there really isn't a functioning state. It's coming apart just after it gets created. There's mutiny in the military. As far as U.S. domestic conditions, again, this is pretty much a constant until we get to Vietnam next week, and that is Americans are concerned about the Cold War. They're concerned about communism, whether it's Castro or Lumumba, even though Lumumba's connection to communism is, pretty hard to define or establish in any way. But nevertheless, if the President of the United States is suggesting Lumumba may be a communist, or certainly affiliating with communism, and that's the message that was being sent by the U.S. government and by the U.S. media, Americans would say, well, okay, well, gee, if something happens to him, too bad, but he shouldn't have been hanging around with communists. So Cold War conditions in the U.S. haven't changed. No one's really going to question what happens at this point or what the president might have to do to deal with situations where he feels national interests are at risk. As far as CIA planning and execution, well, they logically settled on the tactic that could work in the short term. Didn't take a lot of elaborate planning. You didn't have to be cutting off economic assistance or embargoes. You didn't have to spend a lot of time, because they didn't spend a lot of time supporting alternative political forces, although they did some of that. You didn't have to worry about paramilitary operations. It was, can we get a poison in there and eliminate this guy? In fact, of course, they fall short because they never find the assassin. But on the other hand, they are able to facilitate that tactic and successfully assist, even at a distance, in the actual assassination of Lumumba. To summarize it all, we have here a historical crisis rooted largely in the colonial past of the Congo. Many African nations suffered from these problems. Because of the way colonies were put together by the Europeans, we often have conflicting ethnic groups and conflicting regional interests. And most colonies suffered from severe economic underdevelopment. They might have concentrations of wealth in mining, in agriculture, but most of the society was impoverished, poorly educated. The Congo was all of that to an extreme because of Belgian policy. Belgians didn't want to educate even a small group of Congolese. They weren't going to build the infrastructure that was needed for overall development, and they certainly weren't going to encourage the resolution of ethnic and regional conflicts before the time of independence. So it is that colonial heritage that creates the forces for instability that strike almost immediately after independence in the Congo. That, of course, is coming at a time when the U.S. and the Soviet Union are seriously contending with each other for influence in the Third World. So adding to the instability is not just this colonial past, but now the competition between the Soviets and the Americans to see who's going to dominate in the Congo itself. As far as U.S. motivations, in this case, we can reasonably say they pretty well run the gamut. There are economic interests, not in the sense of specific corporations, because the U.S. really has very little, if any, investment in the Congo. It's larger national economic interests, and even that is not entirely direct. It's a question of copper prices in particular will skyrocket if a communist regime can shut off copper exports from the Congo to Europe, Cobalt is an important asset to be acquired from the Congo for making of nuclear weapons. There are some practical economic interests here. And there are strategic concerns mixed with ideological concerns, meaning the Congo has the potential, given its size and economic resources, to heavily influence what happens in much of sub-Saharan Africa after 1960. If it were to be a Soviet-influenced regime, the United States sees that as extremely threatening to the uncertain future that lies ahead as more and more African colonies achieve independence. The old security of European colonialism was gone. The Americans were concerned about where Africa was going and where its resources would go. So all of these factors come together. Concerns about economic issues, strategic issues, ideological issues, all of them come to bear and bring the United States in a very significant way to determine the future of the Congo itself. As far as tactics, they do try to arouse opposition to Lumumba among existing political leaders in the Congo, but the main tactic that they settle on very early on and pursue doggedly is assassination. And it has the real possibility of altering the course of events because, as we've said, we don't have a bureaucratized state, we don't have a bureaucratized political process. Much depends upon individuals. So if you can eliminate an individual, you have a real possibility of altering the course of events. As far as the outcome, it certainly works in the end. It may have been an act of indirection, if you will, in achieving the assassination, in this case at the hands of the Belgian intelligence services, but nevertheless that assassination removes the most charismatic figure in the Congo and the man seen as the greatest threat to U.S. interests. And ultimately, after a bloody civil war, Mobutu does emerge as the dominant figure and a highly pro-American figure for some 3 decades, ruling one of the potentially wealthiest countries and one of the largest countries in all of Africa. So in the end, the United States and the CIA certainly look upon this as having preempted a Soviet challenge and having put in power an ally who would support their interests in the decades ahead. Next time, we'll take a look at a very different kind of case, one that echoes down to the present day in American foreign affairs and American domestic politics, considered a colossal failure by the CIA, and a case that marks a turning point as domestic ideas about foreign policy, the executive branch, and the CIA are all radically changed by this experience. We'll see that next time.